first talk up is going to be Lee Howard. Lee comes to us with a whole lot of history. He's been between 6 and 10 talks we've done historically for Nanog. IPv4 Global is the company of choice at this point in time for him. 30 plus years of experience in networking, knowledge, everything else, IPv4 to v6, everything from soup to nuts, so he's the man. And let's give him a warm sense of applause, and let's get started with the afternoon program. Thank you.
Thank you. When I talk to younger network engineers and they ask for career advice, the first piece of advice I usually give is figure out how money works in your business. Figure out how the decisions are made around how money is going to get spent. Because the more you understand how business decisions are made, how money decisions are made, the more influence you're going to have on making those decisions. You're going to have a better sense for understanding, for being able to frame an argument for why the business should spend money on any given initiative. As network engineers, I think we intuitively start off thinking about this triangle, the good, fast, and cheap triangle. And we see this is not just networking. I learned this in project management. People learn this in Agile, the quality triangle or whatever. And sometimes it's good means some kind of quality, it meets the requirements. And fast means delivery speed, and cheap is maybe just delivered on budget. So there's different ways to frame it. But there's this sort of three-axis shape or matrix, which is a triangle. That makes sense? And there's a couple of different ways to look at this. Now, by the way, most organizations, any kind of organization, are not on one edge of this triangle. You're somewhere in the blue. So in this blue, you've got, I've just put good on top and fast and cheap. And so good could mean reliable, or it could mean very great service, high quality, white glove, best in class customer service. Fast might mean just high bandwidth, high performance, low latency, or it might mean very immediate installation, or very fast service, or very fast delivery. There's a couple of different ways that this can be defined. And cheap might just be a low bill, or it might be additional services thrown in, or it could be the total cost of ownership. And that could be whether you are running a residential ISP, or a cloud services company, or a hardware vendor. There's all of these axes, of course. We're familiar with this. But you're not in any one corner. Generally, you're not in any one corner, you're somewhere along the sides. And so I've described the good and fast axis as being, if those are your two, then you're a premium service. You're good, you're fast. You can't do both of those things very, very well and also be cheapest, right? There are trade-offs that you have to make. So that's gonna be your premium service. You're cheap and fast is possible. Lots of businesses compete on being cheap and fast. They tend not to necessarily be the highest quality service. And maybe it's just because they're lower, they're self-service. Maybe they don't have a customer service line. Maybe that's sort of not the axis that they're competing on. And so that would sort of be in that axis. And then, of course, the cheap and good I would call low cost. It's cheap, it's good, but it's reliable. But you're probably not getting the fastest circuits, the fastest chips, the fastest performance. Okay, everybody gets to choose where in this triangle, every organization gets to choose where in this triangle you're competing for customers. And that's great. And there's space. In many markets, there's space for people in different parts to compete against each other. You don't have to win every single customer, just enough to keep growing and running a good business. That's the way I, as a network engineer, think about how I'm building a network. What are the metrics that I'm doing? The way I, as a business person, think about the network is customers are shoveling sand into a pile, and I'm trying to make as big a pile as I possibly can, but I've got vendors and other costs that are hoeing the sand out of my pile. So that's sort of the way I'm thinking about this, and the goal as a business is to make as big a pile as possible. Now, as a not-for-profit organization, your goal isn't to make as big a pile as possible, but you want to keep things in balance, right? You need to at least cover your costs. And so there's a little bit of a difference there, but you need to not be having too much cost being taken out of the network. There's one more stage in this, which is the protection stage. So there's the risk protection. So sometimes you've got this pile of sand that you're trying to build, and every once in a while it rains, and some of your sand is washed away. Now, risk it's not actually independent of revenue and expense. It's absolutely related. Now, sometimes we talk about risk as being upside risk. There's a chance that our competitor might go out of business and we're going to gain a whole bunch of their customers. There's whatever the odds are. We don't usually think about that. We usually look at those as being windfalls, and we're not necessarily trying to optimize the upside, the likelihood of that happening. But there's also, most of the risks that we talk about are things like making sure that we have redundancy. So that if something goes down, we're not losing customers. If we have backups that we can recover in case of some kind of failure or outage. And there's also regulatory risk. Right? We want to make sure we're paying our taxes. We want to make sure that the utility company is not coming in and regulating us beyond our ability to build out our network. We want to make sure we have power, things like that. Yeah, I think I had more to say on so one of the fun things about risk, and I said it can be either revenue or expense, is the way to calculate the size of a risk is typically you say, well, what are the odds of this terrible thing happening? And then what's the impact of this terrible thing happening? So if there's a 10% chance of a $10 million impact, then I might be willing to spend up to $1 million to eliminate that risk or to mitigate that risk so that I don't have to pay that expense. And that can also, again, work both ways. I can do the same kind of math for figuring out the potential upside risks. So somebody comes along and wants to sell you a bigger shovel. I have a tool that is going to bring in more revenue. Or maybe it's a smaller hoe, it's going to reduce costs. How do you decide whether this is a good deal? Now, what made me want to do this is years ago, I was running a network, and somebody came along and said, you happen to be, your HQ, your hub, is in a lit building, and your data center is actually also on net, and I can provide you a very high-speed circuit between those two locations for very little money. Like, I was shocked. I was a tenth of what I thought it was going to be. And I had built a network that didn't require communications between the HQ and the data center, so I didn't have a model for whether I needed to do this. And it was a great deal, but do I need this? And so I spent years trying to say, what's the model? We ended up doing it, but it was just a gut feeling. There's got to be a way to decide whether to spend this extra money. What's it going to get for me? So finally, kind of what I came to is what I didn't have at the time, partly, was a sense of the revenues and expenses and how my part of the operation was affecting the business. Now, on the quality triangle, good, fast, and cheap, one of the things that you're sort of trying to balance is, are you trying to have a few customers who are paying a lot, or many customers who are paying a little? Again, both are valid business models, but there's a trade-off, and you have to sort of make decisions about which way you're going to go. And then, of course, you've got expenses. How do you serve those customers? How do you get those customers? What's the value you're offering to them? And that can be the great customer service. It can be fast installation time. It can be a better map, whether it's better coverage with fiber or just deeper coverage or better territory. Lots of things to compete on there. If you, as a senior engineer or manager in your network, are not communicating these costs and these revenues and this service proposition to your junior engineers, how can they figure out how to architect a network? How can they decide how to make the right trade-offs that are consistent with the business that you're trying to run? So that one was an extremely important one to me. And by the way, of course, I'm showing that you need to balance these. You don't want to balance these. You want the revenue side to be higher, right? So I kept going through, you've got to build this model, and we want to see if somebody's trying to sell me a new tool that's going to reduce my costs. I've seen a lot of tools that promise to reduce my costs that or avoid costs, and boy, that's a tough sell. A cost avoidance, can you prove to me that if I don't do this thing, I will incur this cost later? I need to see the receipt that shows that I've avoided that cost, or else I'm not sure that I've actually saved any money. That's a tricky one, and you need to be able to do the modeling to come up with what are the odds. There's I talk about models a lot. I talk about how are we coming up with a framework to make decisions. And so after struggling with this, so now I've got a list of how am I making money, how am I spending money. All right, now I come to a project. Somebody's trying to convince me that I need to do something to my network that's going to save me money or it's going to make me money. So I've come up with a project X. Very simple. It's going to cost me, and I've sort of trying to come up with a random example. I've got an initial expense of $500,000 to do whatever this project is that somebody's promised me is going to make me money. Annual maintenance on whatever this thing is. Maybe it's a fiber build out and I've got to do additional maintenance on it or some other kind of data center build out. Annual maintenance, I'm going to have to spend $20,000. This is a model. These numbers don't matter. And then I've got some kind of revenue model. I think that I'm going to make an extra $10,000 as soon as we build it. And then every year, I'm going to make another $10,000 on, so I'm going to get incremental growth on that year over year. Is that a good spend? That's getting a little complicated there, and I need to figure out over what timeline am I talking about whether this is a good project. So let's model this out. Let's do the cash flows. This looks really ugly, and I apologize. I couldn't think of another way to present this kind of information, but it's basically year over year, how much am I spending, how much am I receiving? And so revenues, year over year, I've got the rows there. Expenses, year over year, so it's $500,000 to begin, and then $20,000 a year, excuse me, after that. And so for each year, that third row on that bottom table is just the net for the year, and then the total over time because you subtract the net for the year from that initial expense. So okay, with this project, I've made I think I'll make $210,000 in increased profits in 5 years. Is that worth doing? For an initial spend of $500,000. I still don't know. I still don't know if over 5 years, is that good compared to anything else? So here's a tool. And again, this is going to look really ugly, but I'm going to walk you through it. So there's a tool that you can find in your spreadsheets. It's called internal rate of return, IRR. Pretty simple model, pretty simple function in Excel. And the function is down there at the bottom. It's equals XIRR. And then your values, which is to say your net cash flow for each time period. You can do this by day, by month, by year, doesn't matter. And then what the time period is, the dates. So if I spent, and so right now I'm just sort of summarizing, I'm assuming that $20,000 a year is not being paid out every month or every day or every quarter. I can run it the same way, and the formula will figure out how to match that. So values in yellow, dates in green, just to show how those are correlating. And what I get there on the bottom left is an IRR of 10.2%. I still don't know if that's any good, but at least I have some number that's taking into account the value of cash flow over time. It's looking at how is this going to look over the spread of time. That's helpful. Now I'm getting a little bit of feedback now. What I really want to do is I want to do this for a number of projects and begin to get a sense for whether something's making more sense than not. So if I'm looking at a 10.2% IRR, how does that compare to just putting $500,000 in the bank? Hey, we can actually do that. Let's say I'm making 4%. I don't know what bank rates are right now. But let's say I'm making 4% on my $500,000. I can do the same cash flows. I believe this one is assuming that what I actually did is daily compounding instead of monthly or annual compounding. It matters. It actually makes a significant difference because it does say compounding daily. And there's a formula in Excel for that. You don't necessarily need to know that, but what I was trying to get at is 4% annually, or 4% interest when compounded daily actually adds up to more than 4% in annual income. So I worked out the revenues on that 4%, assuming it's all being plunked back into the bank account and still growing. And so over time, I get an average annual return. I get 4.4%. And that's the same as the IRR calculation when you do the cash flow. It's 4.4%. Okay, so at least I figured out that my previous project X, 10% is better than 4%. So at least now I figured out that I'm better off doing project X than just keeping the money in the bank. That's incredibly useful information. If you're trying to decide whether to do something, your baseline is probably doing nothing, right? If your baseline is what happens if I do nothing and you make 4% per year, you want to make sure you're getting more money than that. Well, you can also do this with what if I borrowed the money? Like a good enough project, a good enough return on a project, if you're paying a certain amount, paying 10% interest to borrow that $500,000, is that better than not doing it? How does that compare? Okay, so I've got this, similar kinds of numbers and same tool. So now the cash flow looks a little bit different now because I'm paying interest every year on the money I borrowed. Now, leverage is a powerful thing. Leverage done right is, and there's a reason it's called leverage. You use a little bit of your own money and a lot of somebody else's money, and you can do big things. But we're trying to find where's the fulcrum, right? That's sort of what matters is what's that interest rate? And how does that affect our overall cash flows and our profitability in the long term? By the way, I'm using 5 years because it fits well on the screen, not because 5 is a magical number of years. Some companies would rather do 7 years, some have 10 years, generally a shorter period of time. A shorter return is going to be easier to convince people because they get their money back faster. They make a profit faster. But it's okay. Sometimes you don't actually see money until the 4th or 5th or 6th year. And if you're doing a fiber build and you're not making money for 7 years and then you're suddenly making tons, your cash flow is way ahead, that may be a great investment. So on this one though, I ended up with the exact same formula, XIRR, and I come up with a negative 2%. I'm actually losing money overall on my cash flow over time. Yeah, I'm probably not going to borrow money to do this project for this set of assumptions. But good, like we have math. We have tools now to figure out whether this is a good idea. Nobody wants to know this. I'm going to skip this. This is the formula for figuring out the net present value of money. I guess I wanted to say that what this is partly doing is it is comparing money today is worth more than money 5 years from now, right? Not because of inflation, just because I can do more because of the effects of compounding, the effects of the passage of time. I can do more with today's money than I can with money that's nebulous and in the future. And this is taking into account that value of money over time. And this is the formula for figuring out the net present value of money. And you can see the internal rate of return is in there. Look it up later if you want to actually see what it says. A couple projects, examples here, different ways to think about this. And again, the important part, the tricky part in many ways, is to come up with the assumptions about what are the revenues that this is going to drive. How much money is this actually going to bring in? And being clear-eyed about that. And you've got to have data from the business. You have to know how much money you make on a new subscriber sign-up, whatever kind of, or a new hardware purchase, or a new, whatever the thing is. You've got to know how much money you make on a build. You probably want to know how much churn you reduce if you sell a customer additional services. So if you're selling vanilla internet access, but selling voice over IP and IPTV will also keep that customer longer, and so you're 10% less likely to lose them in 5 years, you can do the math to figure out that revenue as well. So I've got a couple of different examples here. I think they're fun examples. I don't know if they're based in reality in any way, how I modeled the expense. But we can use the example of, should we spend, I don't know, $100,000 in automation? Well, let's say it's going to cost, I don't know why I said $100,000. Let's say it's going to cost a certain number of hours at a certain rate. That's what the cost is. And now we have to figure out, why are we automating? What's this going to save us? In this particular case, I said, well, we're going to reduce manual data entry, and the number of hours it's going to save is a certain number of hours of certain pay rate. It could be anything. There's all kinds of different ways that you can look at what the value of the automation. Reduce downtime. Again, you need to, what's the value of reducing downtime? How many customers are you going to lose? How much are they paying? How many calls is it going to generate to your call center? And what's the call cost? I've sort of mushed all of those into one number here, but all those are models that your engineers kind of need to know in order to know the value, and as they're designing the resilience of the network, or looking for ways to minimize downtime, or looking for improved, well, should we go work on this improved automation, whether it's detecting an outage and automatically fixing it, what are we going to do? How much is that going to save us by not losing customers? If your engineers don't know those numbers, how can they possibly figure out whether it's worth adding a circuit, adding a router, building a backup site, whatever the additional service is? So I've also included here the risk matrix, so the risk ratio I was talking about. That is the probability times the impact. So it's the probability in percent times the impact in dollars. And so we've got some numbers there. That's how I got to 1,200. Again, the number, this is just for example, numbers are made up. Same thing. We're not generating any new revenue here, but I've got sort of expenses that are negative expenses, because although we're spending $30,000 to begin with to do the project, we're actually reducing our costs later. So it's, instead of losing money, we're reducing our costs on the back end. And so there's the cash flows over time. And now we've got an internal rate of return of 45%. Wow, this project looks way better than project X. That's fantastic. That's going to be a pretty easy sell as long as you can back up your assumptions about revenue, about customer retention and customer calls and all those numbers. I also have the return on investment, like how much money you're going to make back on this. Another number, it doesn't take into account the time value of money, but it shows, hey, just for spending this little bit of money, we're going to make back in 5 years a significant cost recovery here. That looks like a no-brainer. I'd probably do that project. Employee retention. This is not something that we typically think of in terms of cost modeling, right? It's usually just it's a benefit. It's something we try to do. We want to keep employees, but there are absolutely ways to think about this in financial terms, and it's the same ways that we can think about networks and anything else. So if we have an employee says, I want to go spend a week at a training class, and it's going to cost, the training class is going to cost $4,000. By the way, this might be Nanog. The numbers will be a little bit different, but 3 days at Nanog, with the registration fee, register early, your cost for the 3 days is the registration cost, plus your airfare, hotel, cost of the employee being away, the number of hours they're away, the cost times the cost of the employee. Those are pretty easy numbers to come up with, right? You can find the numbers there. So, but in the case of if we're trying to keep employees, if we were to lose an employee, what work is going undone after that employee is gone? What were they going to be working on that was going to be saving us money or making us money? And that's a little bit harder to come up with. And I've tried to put something in here to say, well, so if it's going to take me 480 work hours to replace that employee, and to then it's 480 hours of that work not happening times their cost, and so keeping that employee is saving me that much money. And the next one I have is, okay, so you spent 3 months, 4 months finding a new employee, you've hired them, now you've got to onboard them. You've got to get them to learn your systems, your network, how to do things, your value proposition, all the numbers we've already talked about. There's a lot they have to learn in order to actually become constructive and useful. And I've just sort of modeled that at 960, which is about 6 months, I think, and said, so it takes 6 months to get up to speed, but they're not useless during that time. They're just not as useful over that period as a full-time experienced engineer who's been with you for a while. So I put that at a fraction of the price, and I came up with $48,000. Again, is that true? I don't know. It's a way to model it. It's at least an argument that I could say, hey, to the business, there's a business value in developing our employees. There's a business value in sending our employees to Nanog because they're happier employees. They're making connections. They're getting better at their job rather than getting frustrated and leaving us. I also had to include, again, this is a risk model. Is the employee actually going to leave? Well, maybe if you don't do 4 years, you go 4 years without sending them to some kind of training, maybe there's a chance that in 4 years, on average, they'll quit. Maybe it's 10% chance, maybe it's 50% chance. I don't know. It sort of depends on where in your career you are, what your goals are, and how rewarding the job is. But there's a reason in there to think that. 25, 20%, what, 10%, I don't know. It turns out to be exactly the same model. Once I've got those kinds of ways to think about the value of an employee and the value of their work and the cost of their work and the cost of their work not happening, now I can think about the same thing. So so here's the revenues and expenses over time and the totals, and I come up with an IRR of 26%. You know what? 26% internal rate of return. That means that if I were able to do this, if I were able to spend $4,000 and make back this rate of return, I'd be making 25% every year. If I could find 25% return on my investments, I'd be thrilled. That's a good rate of return, and that's also, compared to some of our other projects, pretty exciting, pretty solid. Is this true for your company? I don't know. I'm making numbers up. Another one, this is another project that ISPs in particular talk about a lot, is should we spend more money on customer service? Well, customer service is a tough place to actually prioritize for spending money. Customer service, so I've got to go develop training for my call handlers. And that training, generally when I put together training, I'm planning on at least 5 hours of development time per hour of material. It often turns into 7 or 8 hours, and then I usually, once I've taught it once, I go back and put in another hour per hour. So this is sort of an iterative process, but I've just said, all right, what's gonna take me 300 hours to develop a class, and my course developer is costing me $100. All right, there's a baseline cost. CSR time, so I'm training them. They're spending 50 hours in annual training, and they're offline, they're costing me $80 while I'm training them, plus they're just not working. So I've got those numbers in there. But a better trained support team is gonna reduce my ticket time. That's the idea. I hope it does. By the way, I would also hope that you have metrics on that. You probably, if you're running a professional call center, you probably do have metrics on mean time to repair or average ticket close time for each call center employee. That's the sort of thing that is tracked in call centers. So you can see what the effects of training before and after. It might take a couple of years before you have enough data to know whether it's working, whether the training is helping, but you can see that. And hopefully good customer service training is going to reduce cancellations. The best customer service experience is when a customer calls up angry and gets a great experience and leaves happy. Those are really hard to do, but those are the ones that people talk about. You can't thrill and exceed a customer's expectations if they never have a need to talk to you. It's an oxymoron, a paradox, but it's true that if your opportunity to excel and shine in a customer's eyes is when they're unhappy. That being said, not everybody's competing on the good corner of the triangle. So maybe that's not where you want to focus, and that's part of what we need to look at in the customer churn, the value of the customer. If you're focused on fast and cheap, then maybe the value of cancellations isn't as significant. And also, happy customers tend to buy more. Happy customers might upgrade. So I've included some assumptions about how much more money we'll make because of reduced cancellations and increased and new sales. And then happy CSRs stick around longer. Sort of the same thing as the professional development slide I just did, that if you can reduce the churn, then you've reduced the cost of work not being done, and you've reduced actually potentially call-outs, and then you've eliminated a lot of the ramp-up costs. It's funny. It's exactly the same model. Revenues, expenses, cash flow over time. Wow, in this case, with this set of assumptions, which are absolutely pulled out of thin air, these assumptions are based on nothing in real life, but with this set of assumptions, my IRR is 52%. Wow, that's for spending $1 million on customer support. That's pretty good. If I can keep more people in customer support by providing better training and providing better customer service, that's pretty great. And the ROI is 200% on that. Now, part of the difficulty is customer support people, they tend to come in entry level, you train them up, they get excited, they want to do more senior jobs. It is pretty great though, if you can, after a little bit of time, promote somebody who knows your network and knows your systems and promote them to something more technical and give them a growth path, that's a pretty fantastic thing. I think I have one more of these. Should we spend $500,000 on improving security? But this is risk modeling, right? It sort of depends on how much security, what's it going to cost, what risk is it mitigating? If it's mitigating the risk of something that is never going to happen, like I'm not going to spend $500,000 mitigating the risk of a meteorite hitting one of my racks in my data center. That's not a risk that I probably want to spend time on because the likelihood is so low. And probably the impact is probably still only $10,000 or so. Like that's a risk that I can probably just eat that risk. But okay, so we're avoiding lost work due to downtime because people can't get to their systems, or there's the data is unavailable, whatever it is. Avoiding lost business. Obviously, it's really embarrassing when you have a security incident. I've said we're going to spend $500,000 for whatever it is, and there's some kind of annual maintenance. Whatever, it might be software licensing, it might be doing updates, it might be just making sure that we're actually following our processes, doing audits. And then the probability of attack per year. Why 40%? I don't know. I just made up that whatever risk we're trying to mitigate was 40% likely. There are a lot of risks. And by the way, I've been talking to a lot of smaller networks who are saying, you know what? nobody's trying to get into my network. And I'm like, you know, there are state actors who are trying to get into your network. I'm not saying there's one guy sitting at a cubicle someplace who is banging away at the edges of your network trying to break in. No, there are systems, there are automated systems trying to break into everybody's network. Salt Typhoon, we know, was not a narrow targeted attack. It was a broad attack. And I think that everybody is a potential risk for those kinds of attack. So I picked 40% per year. I don't know. It's for this particular risk, whatever it is. We do exactly the same thing. And we have, again, all we're really trying to do is compare. In this case, because the impact was so low and the probability was so low, it turns out maybe this isn't the most important risk to mitigate. That being said, I assumed that we're only going to lose $100,000 in business, that we're only going to that the work to repair it or come back from it is only going to be $120,000. If that were higher, this would be completely different. If I knew that somebody was coming after me and my odds of being exploited in some way were 80%, that would be significantly different. So in this particular case with these numbers, you know what? Yeah, I would like to have a more secure network. I would like to spend money on security, but this is the sort of, if I'm going to a risk committee and they're saying, well, tell me the trade-offs, like how big a risk is it? What's the impact? What's the likelihood? How much is this going to cost? This is the kind of analysis they're looking for. And they're going to look at this and say, I think we're just going to spend another $1,000 a year on insurance. That's a better use of our money. And go put this $500,000 into customer service or employee retention or other things that make more sense. Yeah, it's a little politically awkward to have chosen the security one to be the negative model. So all of that being said, really what I was hoping for you to take away here is you, as a network operator or a vendor of any kind, running an organization of any kind, need to decide and articulate where in that value triangle you are. Good, fast, and cheap, you're somewhere in the middle, probably not dead center. If you're dead center, you're doing everything reasonably well, but you're vulnerable to attacks from competitors on all sides. If you're closer to one side or one point, then you've sort of chosen where you are in that, and you're going to lose business to others, but you've chosen a point to say, we believe that our customers in our market are more interested, we're going to make more money on this particular value proposition. You need to communicate this information to your employees. If you don't know how much money you're making on customers, if you don't know how much things cost, you're never going to be able to figure out whether any expense is a good expense. So you need to know how much revenue does it add, how much expense does it avoid, can you prove that it's going to reduce those expenses? A lot of things are, well, you know, you're probably going to be able to avoid something here. No, I need something, at least a reasonable, a defensible assumption that I can hang on this in order to make this decision. And then for risk mitigation is how much risk does it mitigate? Whether that's buying insurance or putting an intrusion prevention system in or a DDoS mitigation service or box, whatever it is, how much risk is it mitigating? What's that cost? What's the revenue for us? And that's how you calculate risk. The ROI tells you the rate of return, but the internal rate of return takes the time value of money into account so you can make decisions based on not just what's happening this year, but what's going to happen over time. I know that was a sort of a lot to throw at you. It's a whole lot of modeling, a whole lot of financial way to think about how we run and build networks. But this is, again, what I try to communicate to younger engineers is that these are the things that you need to be thinking about and need to know as you're trying to optimize your network. Because if you don't know where your optimization is, you're never going to be able to find the right optimization for your network. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Great talk, Lee. Again, maybe some models that weren't completely defined, but the concepts, of course, are great to be able to go and do analysis like that and compare different options, things like that. While we're here, any questions for Lee? You all are spellbound, I can see. All right, if we have no questions, and I know there's nothing online because I was looking myself, Alex, so we're good to go. Good. Lee, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Again, beautiful talk. Again, another round of applause for Lee, please. And we will have him back again for another talk at some point in time in the near future.